Before we get to Paul, a quick note about our sponsor. The Blockchain New Zealand podcast is brought to you by Easy Crypto. 5 years ago, a passionate bunch of Kiwis created Easy Crypto in New Zealand to enable Kiwis and others to buy and sell cryptocurrency. The Easy Crypto website is simple and straightforward. They have heaps of great educational content that caters to both beginners and experts and are very transparent about fees. You can buy crypto with New Zealand dollars or with your credit card and get crypto sent directly to your wallet. Investing in cryptocurrency can of course be risky, so always do your own research. Visit easycrypto.com to start your crypto journey today. And now my conversation with Paul Stonham. So Paul, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jeff.
You are coming to us today from Sydney, and I think specifically the ASX. So it seems like you've been with the Australian Stock Exchange for a little while, well before you were into the blockchain side of things. Can you tell us what you were doing a little bit before then? Were you more into traditional market activities? And then how did you get into blockchain? And then we'll talk more about what actually it is that you're up to right now.
Great. Thanks, Jeff, and thanks to Blockchain New Zealand for having us today. So I guess, as you mentioned, yes, sort of background is more traditional sort of derivatives and equities trading, but always from, I guess, a technology perspective, whether that be in trading systems and co-locations and networks from a business development perspective. So, been involved in trading system replacements and enhancements and upgrades and things like that. And then also ran, ASX has another business called Technical Services here, which is really about sort of, infrastructure as a service, whether that be data center and co-location, networks and things like that too. So always sort of had an interest in the technology side from traditional financial markets. And then obviously once ASX decided to go down a DLT path with its chess replacement project, sort of that piqued my interest to sort of pivot in and find out a bit more about this. Probably it's not as emerging as it used to be a few years ago, but because we're sort of into the weeds of it and all that sort of stuff. But 3 or 4 years ago, the ASX started up the DLT solutions team, or the solutions business, and we sort of launched ourselves in production late last year.
Okay, so 3 or 4 years ago, that's earlier than I would have expected.
Yeah, so I guess the ASX sort of announced the whole, I guess, the adoption of the DLT-based technology for chess, probably 4 or 5 years ago now, I'd imagine. So I think we were probably one of the early adopters, at least from I guess, an enterprise exchange background in the tech. And again, I think, at its core, I guess, for us, and I really sort of see it as, at least at its minimum, is it's the next generation of database technology that has the potential to do all these different things, whether it's sort of TradeFi, CFI, all the way out to DeFi. But at its core, if you're looking to upgrade a database, or you've got a really old database and you want to sort of try and sort of step, or if you do the whole crawl, walk, run down a given path, then I think just using and having a look at this technology just for its next generation of database attributes, it would be a fascinating journey on its own for potential companies and users of the tech stack.
Yeah, you're right. It's absolutely a database technology, and databases have come a long way since sort of the rise of computing, 1950s, 1960s, remote terminal access, these types of things. And then along the way in the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of research on distributed systems. That kind of went away for a little while. Then blockchain came along, Bitcoin came along, and now there's just been an absolute massive resurgence in this. So can you go ahead and tell us what DLT is, and tell us what that means in terms of as a service?
Great. So, what we sort of, I guess, identified early on, and sort of, I guess, ASX has identified early on in some of our other infrastructure as a service businesses is we obviously use, enterprise grade, highly available, highly sort of stable products, whether that be a data center, whether that be a network, and ultimately whether that be a DLT infrastructure. So the exact same infrastructure that the ASX is going to use for the chess application, we've packaged that up into, I guess, an as a service option to offer to customers to actually, whatever applications they want to write for any use case, obviously provided it's legal, I guess. Customers can get access to that exact same tech stack, managed, operated, maintained by ASX, so they can then just concentrate on the smart contracting layer and the north-facing application layer of what makes their application special, and what attributes do they want to market to potential users of that application, bearing in mind that that application is now writing sort of smart contracts onto a ledger, that's maintained and monitored and upgraded and things like that by the ASX.
Right. So this idea of highly available, I mean, in terms of our contemporary, I guess, acceptance of, streaming on demand, worldwide, global, everything's available at our fingertips. This is sort of more and more important. And you do really end up getting into the details there. And so I think in our earlier chat, you mentioned for a while you've been fully involved in the data center side of things. And so now, presumably, you have a section of that or a branch of that that's dedicated to this ledger service.
Well, we've actually gone, I guess, a lot of our customers are already adopting cloud, and where I mean, most exchanges are adopting cloud. So what we've done is deployed, where we're sort of, using the VMware blockchain, and we're using the digital asset modeling language, the exact same sort of smart contracting language and the exact same blockchain that we're using for chess. We've spun that up into a multi-zone AWS cloud. So we have our sort of consensus or committer nodes, using sort of a Byzantine fault tolerance system across multiple Amazon Australian sort of base zones, for redundancy and that sort of stuff. And we're obviously maintaining customer and client nodes across all those zones as well, such that there is no sort of single point of failure that would sort of, I guess, bring down the platform. And I guess when you sort of think about it, you sort of mentioned things happening in the 80s and 90s and that sort of stuff, you would find that, most places would just have a primary site and a secondary site. I think, what sort of DLT and the distributed nature of some of the tech stack is bringing in that more meshing capability, such that, hopefully from a technology perspective, you'll find less downtime on DLT based environments, and not just ours, probably any of them. They all share similar attributes. They all might use different types of fault tolerances and failovers. But I think that's one real, that's as from I guess from an IT or from an uptime perspective, I think that's one real good attribute that a DLT platform can bring to the table.
Yeah, back in the day when these things first got underway, if your distributed system is only two terminals, two computers, or two data centers, and if one of those lines goes down, then the message passing between the two, the first one would have to just wait indefinitely for a receive message to be acquired, and then you send an acknowledge back and forth, and the same thing might happen at either end. And so the whole research into distributed systems has looked to find better ways to do this. And so one thing you mentioned there was, so VMware's blockchain uses a Byzantine fault tolerant consensus method. And so basically
and I know you've got a maths background, Jeff, so you probably understand the mechanics of it probably better than me.
Well, I have spent a lot of time trying to understand specifically PBFT, which is the original algorithm called practical Byzantine fault tolerance. And it's like the academic paper that was published is notoriously impossible to read. And so a bunch of smart people got together and actually created an algorithm to implement this. And that's what a lot of these systems are based on today, including VMware's. So in terms of this idea of DLT to blockchain, are we calling it a blockchain? And if we are, like, it's not a traditional blockchain, is that right?
Look, again, I mean, from my perspective, I'm sort of, I guess I'm not on the, if you sort of compare it to a politics, I'm sort of not on the left wing sort of CFI fanatic. I'm not on the right wing DeFi fanatic. I'm on sort of a thing, whatever works
Okay,
for you as a potential user.
great. You're an engineer
Great,
then.
great. Whatever you, if you want to start over here, and if it works for whatever your use case or what your customers want, great. If it's over here and it works, sort of great. So for me, again, as a sort of business development and business owner, I sort of tend to use sort of blockchain and DLT sort of interchangeably. Although
Yep.
some of our customers or some of the engineers and some of the technical advocates sort of into the weeds would sort of admonish me or call me out for that. But I think when we're sort of talking to sort of enterprise institutional type of customers, I generally use those sort of things interchangeably. And that sort of, again, when you're sort of talking at a high level of the attributes of a system, I think the less complicated you can make it, and maybe the more analogies you can use as well, makes this tech stack a lot more easy to understand.
Yeah, fair enough. And I mean, even people that talk about things that look the same, maybe a Bitcoin and an Ethereum, uh, you get the same kind of response between someone that's always a level up and
Yeah.
says, "Well, no, actually, I think it looks more like this."
Yeah, look,
Um,
and I think again, I mean, to get that mass sort of institutional enterprise adoption, the more uncomplicated we can sort of make it, or the more uncomplicated you can make a use case, or the more uncomplicated you can make the description of a proof of concept or a pilot, it's going to make the path to adoption, I think, a lot more smooth.
So this is one of the benefits of using. You also mentioned the smart contract language. It's called DAML or DAML.
Yep.
So it stands for Digital Asset Modeling Language. And this is one of the benefits people are speaking about. I don't have personal experience with it, but they're saying just what you said is that it's more simple.
Yeah, and again, I mean, we've proven that to ourselves as well, sort of our engineering teams that have sort of been familiar with other languages. So again, it's as we sort of joked about it last time we spoke. It's a functional based sort of Haskell based programming language, and the number of lines of code you need to do the same thing in other languages is a lot less. And generally speaking, sort of you don't need to come from a coding background to be able to follow the workflow. So business analysts and others could actually follow the code and follow the workflow. And there's always sort of, I guess, an outcome. So in terms of being able to user acceptance tests, complete your NFR tests, and that sort of stuff, we've found it's a lot less work when we're doing stuff in DAML than when we're doing stuff in other protocols, be that DLT protocols or be those traditional protocols.
Yeah, just as I was reading up on some of this stuff, I did find, for example, about Haskell, the technical people, the programmers actually, they say that this type of language is a programmer's programming language. And the reason they say that is that once you learn to do it well, you're less prone to writing errors, which, as we know and we've seen in the industry, every smart contract that gets published is really a honeypot, especially if it gets popular for hackers and attackers to poke and prod and try to see if they can, drain the funds
Mm,
or
mm.
steal that NFT or something. And then just of note here, I read that the bank Barclays, they also have used the Haskell as their language for their derivative algorithms for the same reason that it's too risky to have an area where you've got an error that you might not even find at the time. So let's talk about some of the people that are using this.
Yeah, great. So I mean, we're as I sort of mentioned, the platform's called Symphony. We launched it late last year. Our first customer was the New South Wales government, and KPMG sort of won a tender for that in construction industry transformation. So that's really, I coin it as taking the DNA of a building or taking the DNA of an apartment building. What constitutes that? So the concrete, where did it come from, what grade was it, who certified it, who poured it, when was it poured, steel, cladding. Obviously, we've all sort of seen issues with apartment cladding, in the UK and here in Australia and potentially in New Zealand as well. Waterproofing, who certified all that sort of thing. And what this application will do, will take in all that DNA of that building. And then again, they'll have they've got some, people far more smarter than us, the actuarists and stuff, and the modelers that will actually then use all that data to actually rank or rate a trust score for that building. So again, as these buildings are coming up, all the inputs will be put into the immutable ledger. A trust score will be produced. So again, from a consumer or someone who's looking to buy an apartment, that's a really, really piece of valuable information. But again, for others in the ecosystem, and you think sort of about the ecosystem that sort of already sort of is part of ASX's ecosystem today. They could be insurance companies that could plug into this application very easily because that data would be valuable to them because they again may change premiums depending on the attributes of a building. Banks again who lend against these buildings, again they may have different rates and different premiums associated with different types of buildings, and ultimately the builder or the owner of the building, for one of the first times sort of ever would have an immutable, auditable record of their ESG reporting, right? Because again, all those inputs are sort of,
Yep.
the carbon and the embodied carbon and things like that. They'd be able to extract that data and put them straight into the financial reports. And then that data is immutable and auditable for anybody that wanted to sort of do that as well. So I think it's whilst it sort of was, its initial use case was about sort of, construction industries and tracking and tracing the DNA of an apartment, it's sort of, it can snowball. And that's the beauty of, I guess, blockchains and DLTs and ecosystems, that anybody else can sort of, with the appropriate permissions, add a node in and snowball and get sort of the effects, or increase the usability of different apps depending on sort of what the app does and what the data does and things like that. So for me, like, it's really fascinating to see sort of the snowball effect of some of these applications sort of, throughout the ecosystem to users who you wouldn't have maybe thought was a day one sort of user and things like that. So that app's live now, and we've got quite a few others on our user acceptance testing environment. We've
Yep.
also got a sandbox environment for those who just want to learn about DAML and download a few libraries and have a play around. But there's others there in sort of corporate governance and company secretarial sort of services for listed companies. Back office automation, eliminating paper and reconciliation, events for, again, banks and brokers and custodians and that sort of thing. Registry is a big one too. So again, whether that's sort of super member register records, there are a number looking at private equity, again, the tokenization of private equity and the registry services, for private companies and that sort of thing. And more recently, we're sort of, having a lot of conversations with owners of, I guess, real assets, wanting to explore the capability to tokenize these assets to either, make that market more efficient or take that market to potentially to new users. And things like that. So I think the application of the technology is only sort of going to grow and going to snowball. And sort of we're really seeing that from, I guess, the inbound inquiries now we're starting to get from Australia and New Zealand based customers, and also obviously what we're sort of seeing overseas as well with what other exchanges and what other institutions are doing with the technology too. I mean, Broadridge have launched a big bond repo platform in the US, and that's now sort of matching and trading and reconciling billions of dollars of bonds and repos in the US at the moment. So the institutional customers for specific use cases probably starting on a more of a private permission type of blockchain or private permission type of ledger, are really starting to get, hopefully, more comfortable with using the technology for large transactions.
Yeah, I agree that the applications here are kind of only limited by someone's creativity. I think, to me and to a lot of people, they might think that the application sort of maybe starts and ends with something like traditional settlement, and maybe being able to speed that process up or produce an immutable, auditable record that is accessible by third parties. But just the first example you mentioned there about the building industry. So you mentioned about ESG requirements. Is this related to something like carbon credits and tracking, that
It
sort
could
of?
be exactly, yeah. I mean, or even if it was an apartment building and the strata company wanted to make it an ongoing carbon neutral building, they would be able to know exactly what carbon footprint it took to make that building, what its ongoing emissions are of that building, and then obviously potentially offset that with some type of carbon credit arrangement into the future. So I think that's really a great characteristic of this technology, is that others can get access to this information to do better things as well.
And just to stick on this for one more thing, the idea of a trust score, can you expand on that? Like what is the trust?
So I guess it's the trust in terms of how high, what's the quality of the building. So did all those components come from
All right.
reputable companies? Were they certified, by independent government authorities and things like that? So it was almost like when you go into a Harvey Norman or a technology shop and look at a fridge or a washing machine or a dryer, you get the star ratings about how efficient it is. So again, having that sort of star rating for a building as a consumer, sort of to say, is this a high quality building? Did they use the best components? Was everything certified by
Yep.
independent validated certifiers, or did people just sort of self-certify? And then if they've self-certified, how reliable are those records? So, the algorithms built within the application, do all those sort of weightings and things like that. But obviously, I'm not the subject matter expert on
Yeah, that's all
how
right.
they've done it, but they've made a little video that sort of explains that sort of stuff, which we can maybe put in a link somewhere along the lines.
We can start to get the feel, though, that these types of business relationships are quite complex, and the idea of putting them on a standard blockchain doesn't necessarily fit. Especially when you think about various privacy concerns, who wants to see the data at what point. Lately in New Zealand, we've had a jib crisis, And this idea of a trust score might be related to that as well. The way that it stood was that I think only like one major company sort of met the regulations, and it was fine until all these supply chain issues crept up, and then builders wanted to go find a supplier and import their own jib, and somewhere along the way it doesn't meet requirements, and spools into quite a big mess.
And I think, and the bigger ecosystem you could have of users, whether that's, port authorities, transport companies, et cetera, and whilst and the traceability is almost sort of generic. Is it an apartment building? Is it an agricultural type of asset? So once you can get all those components correct, especially if you're a fintech or an institution coming up with these ideas, if you can get it working, for one type of asset class, or again, given at the moment this particular application is just for the state of New South Wales, well, apartment buildings are built pretty much the same everywhere, right? In Australia and New Zealand and probably the world. So, if you've got a good idea, and the beauty of, I guess, the smart contracting modeling language we're using is the fact that it's deployable not just on our blockchain. Digital Asset have made that integrated into other blockchains, into just a normal Postgres database. So if you wanted to take your application and sell it to a customer in Singapore or in New Zealand or in the US, you're not having to build the whole application from scratch if they potentially want to use a different blockchain. So it's almost like it's starting to solve that whole Android iOS
Yeah.
issue. If we sort of take a mobile phone sort of example, you've only got one set of code. That code is DAML, and it'll now work and integrate to multiple different ledgers or even just traditional Postgres databases.
Yeah, it's definitely another benefit. I believe they call this composability. But essentially, if you folks, write something either for building industry or for asset settlement that works really well, then it's much more easier to pick that up and drop it into a different chain and a different industry entirely. You generally don't get this, even through like other smart contract languages like Solidity. You have to, check which version you're using because it might not be compatible with the future version, and on it goes. And so that's definitely one of the benefits of this type of DLT. Do you know anything about other enterprise blockchains in the space? Not do you know anything about them, but sort of from your point of view, what sets you folks apart? Like I'm thinking there's IBM running hyperledger. Amazon has one as well.
Yeah, look, I mean, and look, I don't think, and this is just my own personal opinion, but I don't think there's going to be a winner of the blockchain or the ledger wars. I think we'll end up in an environment where we have multiple different ledgers and customers just choose the one that works best for them and the one they're most comfortable with. What we're seeing and what we're really working on is the layer below that as to how do we make the assets on any blockchain interoperate with others. So, if something's minted on our platform, but it needs to be taken over to an Ethereum-based ledger or a Quarter-based ledger for utility or for collateral on something else, how do we make that available? And again, there's obviously a number of banks here in Australia looking at stable coins. Some of those are being minted on a private Ethereum blockchain too. But how do we get that asset from a private Ethereum blockchain into our platform such that customers can use the utility of those coins to again make processes and commerce more efficient? So we're looking at sort of again potentially a wallet layer or a wallet type of infrastructure where you can sort of lock and mint or burn and release and all that sort of stuff to make now. And I think exchanges sort of have that trusted relationship, or they are a trusted intermediary where they would be trusted to sort of lock and reissue or lock and remint, and ensuring no sort of double spend, double counting, and that sort of stuff, and obviously also ensuring that those assets don't go missing, which is the most important thing, especially when you're sort of talking about valuable real world assets, be them a stable coin or a CBDC or a tokenized bond or a tokenized equity or a tokenized real estate for that matter.
So on this point about trust, I read one of your articles that you wrote about speed and trust. So I'll just read a piece of this for the audience here. So you're talking about finance basically being a little bit sluggish to innovate, or at least compared to crypto. Of course, everything
Or
might be
maybe conservative.
a bit more conservative. Yeah, everything is conservative compared to crypto. You say, I know that trust is a very loaded term in the digital asset world, where the trustlessness and permissionlessness of decentralized exchanges and wallets are seen by many as a matter of principle. But the truth is, if blockchain is going to go mainstream as the basis for financial infrastructure or assets, then it's going to have to gain the trust of companies and consumers. So I guess my question here to follow, is this going to be a requirement for token, like a prerequisite for tokenization of assets? Is this ultimately what we're going to need for offering this type of service?
I think for real world valuable assets, I think that's where it will start because, again, the adoption of this new technology is embryonic. So I think, if we're sort of going to go crawl, walk, run, I don't think anybody's going to start crawling on a fully decentralized, DEX with real world assets with all your smart contracts open for both the good actors and the bad actors to see. So I really think initially to get any traction, it will start probably more in a permissioned platform. And I think once people get comfortable with the tech, they may go out. But I think if that's the first thing you're going to do, that's to me is high risk. And obviously, as I sort of said, institutions, enterprises are conservative by their nature, and they're obviously conservative because most of us are regulated by regulators. We can't have those mistakes. You can't be on the front cover of the Financial Times or the AFR and things like that because something's sort of gone wrong in a decentralized platform where you don't know anybody who you're dealing with and talking to and that sort of thing. So I really think that's my personal point of view from an enterprise institutional type of perspective. I think those assets, would be tokenized in a more permissioned way. And then it may grow from there, or we might find there's enough efficiencies from there as, again, provided, again, that there's not big walls up to get others into that ecosystem that can actually add value to that.
Do you think we'll ever see something like real estate on a blockchain, like tokenized land?
I think yes. I mean, I think if you think about, again, like, the paper-based titles of land registries and again, how long, settlement for a residential user and all the amounts of paperwork and the settlement processes and even like even if it's just up leasing and the paperwork associated with leasing. I think any multi-party workflow that involves paper and wet signatures, the movement of whether it's checks or cash is a great use case for a DLT application because, again, the beauty of the DLT is that single source of truth. So any party that's permissioned to see that information at any point in time can do that. So
Yeah.
I mean, there's obviously delays if you're with real estate, when your agent tells you to transfer, the deposit into here, and it's almost like there's been a lot of scams recently where others are intercepting those emails and people are transferring money to the wrong accounts. But again, if you've got a stable coin on a platform and all the protections around that and things, so I think it's very embryonic at the moment, but I think, and I'd imagine, and I was sort of down in Melbourne last week for sort of FinTech Australia's annual Intersect
Yep.
conference, and the amount of ideas and fintechs and sort of, again, sort of corporate finance and bank type of people are now sort of really getting into this technology and bringing these new ideas and bringing these efficiencies in. I think we're at the start of the journey. It's very embryonic. But I think, once a few use cases start to get a bit of traction, I think we will see more adoption of it.
I like what you said there about what did you call it? Multi-party wet signatures.
Oh yeah, more multi-party workflows that again involve moving paper, sending spreadsheets, sending emails, wet signatures.
Yeah.
I think if you can, and if you can eliminate that into a workflow that anybody that's got a vested interest in that workflow can see at any point in time, it just gives more assurance to everybody within that ecosystem that it's efficient. I can see what's going on. I'm not having to ring someone to say, have you seen my payment? Can you tell me it's there? Where's my receipt? Like, I can see it on the ledger that it's done.
I feel the same way about identity, how our identity is all linked via these pieces of paper that, sort of have wet stamps or, as you say, wet signatures. And we've upgraded a slight bit. if I ever have to do something with a birth certificate, it's now in a PDF format, but it's still a scan of something from decades ago. And so I think that identity is also going this way, and I guess we're going to see the good bits and the bad bits that come out of these transitionary periods.
Yeah, I'm not the subject matter expert on this at all, but there was a lot of sessions last week on sort of the CDR, or the consumer data rights, sort of here in Australia, as to identity, who owns your information, and how that may change in a blockchain, or even a sort of a Web3 type of world, right?
Okay, good segue there to a Web3 type of world. You've been busy this year. You've written quite a few articles, and so I've got another snippet here for us. This one was about NFTs. So you say, for me, the most exciting implication of the coming infusion of blockchain into our culture is that it breaks down barriers between what many regard as the stuffy domain of financial services and the creative world, providing innovators with the technology they need to enable the future of finance in the metaverse is an exciting place to be. And so I like specifically that you mentioned culture in there. Open-ended question here. What are your thoughts? How do you feel about something such as a metaverse? Where do you think this is going?
Look, I think if we start, I guess, at NFTs, and then I love the tech behind an NFT, especially if it's an NFT that sort of has utility. So to me, and you think about non-fungible tokens, for, I guess, if you haven't sort of heard what an NFT is, but I think, to me, there are a lot of things in the financial world that are non-fungible. And especially, we've talked about carbon and ESG before, so some of the voluntary carbon, or even the government or accredited carbon tokens. They're different projects from different types of land in different parts of the world or in different parts of the state. So a lot of that stuff is not fungible because it's not the same. So if you can use some of this, the building blocks of the non-fungibility of a token, to me that has a lot of applicability in some of the financial assets as well. I mean, we spoke about buildings and apartments. Each apartment has a slightly different square meterage, might have slightly different designs. Again, so if you were going to tokenize apartments, you'd probably use non-fungible NFT type of schemas to do that. So I think the applicability is fantastic. And I was over in New York a couple of months ago for NYC NFT.
Oh, you
And
attended that. Okay.
yeah, I did. It was fascinating, just the amount of passion and the amount of ideas going around there. But I think, to me, it's got to have some sort of utility, or some sort of ownership if it's something like art and that sort of thing. So I mean, again, Tennis Australia down here in Australia, sort of, again, for the Australian Open this year, made sort of 6,776 minted tennis balls with different designs, and all those balls represented every single dot that Hawkeye has on the Rod Laver Arena, like the centre court arena for the Australian Open. So anybody who's a tennis fanatic could buy one of those NFT balls. And I guess, again, and it's not probably just Tennis Australia, it's other sporting codes. It's just like, what does that get me? It's a good ball. It's got a cool design, and maybe it's a famous artist who designed it. But a lot of them are using that now as fan engagement. So when we're in New York, Tennis Australia put a message over their Discord that says, anybody that owns this ball, send us your address. We've got a box at the Mets game
Whoa.
at City Field. Anyone that owns a ball can come and can come to the baseball game. So I think, when you're thinking about that fan engagement, or that it's consumer engagement, right? So I think, NFTs, in the retail space, consumer engagement. I mean, are my frequent flyer points, or my frequent flyer, is that going to be a metaverse type of application now, where now I have an NFT of my frequent flyer card and my points, and can I buy different things and all that? And how does that retailer or that airline engage me now, in a different way, perhaps, and probably, the sphere of what they can think about for engagement, consumer engagement, I think it's a far bigger sphere in the Web3 metaverse world than probably the traditional world.
Yeah, I think that sports memorabilia and collectibles, these types of things, I mean, it's such an obvious fit. I feel like maybe in the early stages of this industry, it's been overshadowed a little bit by get-rich-quick schemes and,
Yes.
absurd valuations in some of the collectibles projects. but not even just stuff for fun. And the tennis thing is a great example. I do remember seeing the headline. I didn't
Yeah, I think
see what.
they're up for an award, and I think they only just lost out to Nike, obviously a big
All right.
multinational concourse. So it's not too bad coming second to Nike, I guess. But that was, I mean, it's a fantastic use case, fantastic fan engagement, customer or fan engagement. But there's utility to it. There's utility to owning it.
And on the more boring side too, right? Everything in the real world, is unique down to the atomic level. And so, yeah, every single apartment,
Mm.
absolutely unique. Every single land parcel, absolutely unique. Every single identity document. Also, these things is just such a clear fit to see where this is going.
Yeah,
Um,
and that's the challenge to sort of explain that to decision makers that no, like it's I guess it's the tech behind of what constitutes and what can make or tokenize an NFT. It's not a picture of a cat.
no, and I mean, there's so much space in between those two.
That is true, and that's the thing. It's sort of trying to bring that into the real world and adapt the tech stack for something that's actually useful and usable.
How has the reception been with your colleagues at ASX? You are the GM of the DLT platform section. How is everyone excited about this, or are you kind of a weird dude in the corner?
No, look, I mean, we've got a team now that sort of supports the platform and the engineers that know the protocols and sort of product management and all that sort of stuff. And we're obviously live in production now with customers and things like that. So I think people can see how this technology is going to be used, and it's not just within sort of ASX. They can sort of see some of the banks, whether it's sort of the global ones like BNP and Northern Trust and Goldman Sachs and other exchanges are doing things. So it's almost like if you're not doing something here now, well, you're probably going to be having to play catch up in the future, because you really need to start understanding this tech and potentially understanding the pace of change and how fast things can happen, especially when you've got sort of faster moving fintechs who can the beauty of what we try and do is that the faster moving fintechs now get access to the exact same tech that a market operator uses as well for significant applications. So they get access to the same tech. So they can again move faster. They can sort of market things, and they potentially they can sell, let's call it microservices to institutions that may just solve one problem. But once you solve one problem, it's easy to say, well, okay, if you trusted us to solve that one little problem, how about we work on the second problem and the third problem and the fourth problem? And not so much that they're problems, but there may be inefficiencies. How can we make that more efficient? So I think once it goes back to that snowball effect. Once you can sort of start small and pick something that is tangible, and you're going to sort of you're going to save some operations costs, you're going to increase your compliance capability, you're going to reduce risks, you're going to save capital. I think they're all
Oh, such good
the
keywords.
they're all the ticks that anybody
That's
who's
right.
writing
Yeah.
who's writing a check to you for some capex or some opex needs and wants to hear, to justify that particular project.
Regarding blockchain New Zealand, how do you see an industry organization like this helping the broader industry? And for yourself and you folks, as an Australian entity, joining a New Zealand organization, is that for fun? What's the rationale there?
Well, I mean, ASX does have believe it or not, we do have a New Zealand office. So we have an office in Auckland. Obviously, we have a number of New Zealand companies listed on our markets. We run some New Zealand derivatives contracts on our futures trading system, and we're obviously very close with New Zealand. So to me, really, Blockchain New Zealand, it's a great sort of educational body for its constituents. And if we can sort of help educate sort of customers, and again, we've spoken about a few of our use cases, but obviously, Australia, big agricultural producer, New Zealand, a big agricultural producer.
For sure.
This technology in terms of tracking and tracing and provenance, whether it's meat, whether it's livestock, whether it's wool, wheat, milk. The applicability of this technology, I think, is agnostic to geography. And if we can make the adoption of it as easy as possible, because we're managing, the platform, managing the nodes, managing the services, such that reducing the whole, total cost of ownership and expense to start, let's call it innovating or experimenting with this technology. and educating customers that it's not a big leap to take just to sort of muck around. And we open source some of our libraries and some of our applications so people can sort of, at least sort of get a feel of what they're doing. And if we can do that through a vehicle like Blockchain New Zealand, who has, a group of constituents that are interested in this tech stack to start with, the closer we can get and the more we can do with you, I think the better it is for both us and potentially end users.
Yeah, it's absolutely, the technology is absolutely agnostic to geography, and I'm an open source proponent, and even learning about something like DAML, which was written by a company called Digital Asset, but they've open sourced, it's a programming language.
That's correct, yeah.
And so anyone that sees the opportunity there can come in and benefit and can continue along down the line. So I think that's great, and also good to know that you do have an office here in New Zealand. I'm sure a lot of people do know it, but maybe more will know it now.
And I hope to get over there soon as well, Jeff. So it'd be great to meet you face to face.
Yeah, absolutely. Are you up for some rapid fire to finish us off?
Why not?
All right. So I think I know the answer to the first one I got written down here, but we'll say, are we going to see NFT stock certificates?
I think you might see FT certificates as in fungible, because again, a share of a company is a share of a company. So I think you'll see them first probably in private equity, and that's happening, I think, today. There are a number of our customers looking at that today, and whether that sort of makes its way into the publicly listed exchange world, my belief is that it probably will in the next 5 to 10 years.
CBDCs, are they coming? How far away are they? And is it going to be a dystopian nightmare or part of a digital evolution?
Look, I think it's going to be an evolution, but I also think there's got to be a real world use case for it. So I think, Australia, like New Zealand, we've got some fairly good payment rails at the moment. So I think if you are going to have, or if you're going to convince a reserve bank or a Fed reserve to issue a CBDC, there's got to be some type of real world efficiency from it that can't be replicated with either a stable coin or the existing fiat payment rails and things like that. So I think it will happen, and it's probably going to take the users and companies and institutions like ourselves to work out what that use case is that's going to make something, again, whether it's capital efficiency, risk reduction, that can only be done with a CBDC versus a stable coin or existing sort of fiat payment rails.
In crypto news, the merge is coming in a couple of hours' time. So Ethereum is switching from proof of work to proof of stake. Do you have any thoughts on proof of stake versus proof of work?
I have thoughts on making stuff more efficient. So when you can make something more efficient, when you can reduce total cost of ownership, when you can reduce cost of innovation, I think that's a good thing.
I like this. Paul, you're an engineer at heart. You're interested in how you can practically improve the scenario.
I wish.
Who do you think Satoshi Nakamoto is?
Oh, I have no clue.
Neither do I.
Baby Yoda? Who knows?
Yeah, absolutely could be Baby Yoda as far as anyone is concerned. Paul, thank you very much for coming on the show today.
Jeff, it's been a pleasure. Thanks to you, and thanks to Blockchain New Zealand.
Thanks for joining us, folks. Look out for the next episode of the Blockchain New Zealand podcast, probably in the same spot you found this one. Cheers.